So part one, how do we get here, right? We kind of faced in recent years like a perfect storm, right? There was obviously the COVID pandemic, and that changed organizing. And COVID was really hard on the stability of local Green Party chapters. I can tell you, having been involved in the 2020 presidential campaign, our Green Party locals were really devastated by COVID. It pushed our meetings online, which made it hard to engage with each other and the community, right? And how to actually do organizing during the pandemic. And as one of the main systems and tech people in the party, I can say the party wasn't ready. The party wasn't ready to make the shift to digital organizing that COVID required. And so we were really, really hurt by that, right? Obviously, our base, which is largely working class folks, was the list of, that's the demographic that was hit hardest by COVID, right? The lack of healthcare, increased work hours. There was less time to get involved in the party. And then we were pushed online. So the time that we were, able to get involved in the party often wasn't as efficient as we might have been in our one-on-one meetings. Now, if you've watched one of my systems workshops, you'll hear me preach, right, that we need to get off of efficiency only happening in these in-person meetings, and we need to get better at day-to-day, organizing and collaboration, between the meetings, online and digitally. But I don't necessarily think that, while I hoped it would, that COVID pushed us to that place. I don't think we saw that as the end result. I think we probably saw some improvements in that area, but we didn't, very effectively switch. And our base was hit by all the normal COVID stuff too, right? Yeah, it made it hard, yeah, we were working longer, and yeah, it made it harder to organize, but also our kids were home and being, and we had to deal with all the psychological impacts of COVID and the lockdowns and everything. So, political organizers had to deal with, organizing problems on top of all of the personal and social problems that came with COVID. We've seen, the good news is we've seen a rise in working class unionizing. We're seeing success in that unionizing from the bottom up level, right? We're seeing successes at Starbucks with Starbucks Workers United. We're seeing successes at at Amazon with their bottom up, organizing in New York. But what we saw in Alabama, and this is very much tainted by Amazon doing illegal things and stuff like that. But in Bessemer, Alabama, when it was a top-down organizing project where outside organizers came in from a major union and tried to change things, they failed, right? But we saw in New York, bottom-up organizing, a pissed-off ex-employee was able to organize and win, right? And so that we've seen some changes, right? And we've seen kind of reinvigorated labor come out of the COVID pandemic, because no matter who was in charge, whether it was Trump and the Republicans or Biden and the Democrats, workers were always at the bottom, right? Workers bore much of the brunt. Corporate profits were sky high during the pandemic, right? The stock market was inexplicably sky high when it should have been crashing during something like that. Workers bore the brunt of it, and we have seen some, push on the on organized labor front, which is good. But we've got to grow that. We've got to get outside of just that. We've got to get out, get into our larger community organizing, solidarity networks, and into independence, right? We've got to break free of having all of these things lead into the dead end of the Democratic Party. There's an ebook linked here by Bill Berry. There's a green out of Maryland. It's called Organizing in the Time of the Pandemic. It's free, but it's got some really good tips about, how to shift during the pandemic. And while we're told that the pandemic is over, right? Well, it's clearly not, but we're told that it's over, and many people are kind of moving into the old normalcy, trying to move into the old normalcy. A lot of the things we should have picked up during the pandemic, or the things that Bill talks about in his book, are valuable to us post-pandemic, right? One of the problems that Greens have often had, and I've yelled at Greens about this for years, was that if you didn't show up at a certain time in a certain place, you weren't involved. right? If you didn't make it to that meeting, you were disenfranchised within the party. You didn't have a voice, and you often didn't have a way to get involved, right? We need to take some of the digital organizing things we hopefully learned during the pandemic and extend them, right? And we saw that in Illinois, where I'm from. We're now all of our we had our first in-person workshop, or not workshop, state meeting recently, but we went hybrid, and there were more people attending hybrid than there were in person, right? And in the old days, right, pre-pandemic, those people who attended hybrid, the majority of the people in the meeting wouldn't have been involved. They wouldn't have been able to participate because we didn't have a hybrid system before. So, COVID is a really big, part of that perfect storm that we've seen recently that devastated the, Green Party locals. Garrett?
Yeah. This kind of feeds in a little bit to my comment on our communications platforms, right? That the national party's national committee has a voting system, for example, where delegates can vote online. But that's not necessarily true in all of our state and especially local parties. And so when COVID hit, this was a big change for a lot of our local parties. And, especially in Pittsburgh, we had a lot of pains around that because we had a very established cycle of once a month we would get together and have this in-person, face-to-face, discussion and voting and things like that. There's nothing wrong with that. And in fact, a lot of times, that face-to-face discussion is really where, interesting ideas are discussed and hammered out and get turned into really good plans. But like Chris is saying, that even in the best of times, that could leave people out. And we literally had people who would tell us, oh, that sounds great, but your monthly meetings are on Tuesdays, and Tuesday's my day where I work late, or nobody can watch my kid that day, or whatever the case was. Right? We literally had people tell us, I want to be an active green, but I cannot make it that day. And then the problem would always be, of course, that if you said, okay, well, let's pick a different day, then someone else would say, oh, but I could do Tuesdays, but I can't do Wednesday, or I can't do Saturday, or, and it would always be this problem. So I've been an advocate for a long time, too, about setting up systems where even if we have these face-to-face meetings, we can still schedule those. But a lot of our important decision-making and communications and all needs to be on some sort of online platform where everybody can see it, everybody can contribute and discuss and vote on it. And we didn't really have that in place. So when COVID hit, and especially, I don't know how every state handled it, but in Pennsylvania, there was actually stay-at-home orders for a while, and just everything shut down for weeks. Not really that long. I feel like a lot of people kind of, in hindsight, they really try to overblow that, oh, we were locked down for years. No, it wasn't that. But, and in fact, it wasn't even necessarily a government order. It was just a lot of businesses and groups just decided on their own, we're just not going to do this anymore. And particularly leftist groups, right? We're not going to have meetings anymore because we actually care. We don't want people to get sick. So we're not going to have these in-person meetings anymore. And that caused this issue where without our monthly meetings, there wasn't really any clear guidance on how we carry forward. And so everyone scattered. And so some people said, well, I guess I'll just start writing in Slack more often. And some people said, oh, Slack doesn't really work on my phone. I'm going to start typing in Facebook more. I'm going to start using Twitter more. And, I'm just going to send an email thread. And then the email thread would, instead of go to a mailing list, they would type in the people that they remembered, right? And so you'd get the email chains of 250 people or whatever, but it wouldn't include everybody in the party. So you'd have to forward it to, it just became a mess. And so this is really a lesson that locals have to learn, I think, on how can we communicate and effectively, and not just like an email blast or an email list, but a way that you can actually have a discussion. It's two-way as opposed to one-way. And that includes the ability to be able to vote easily, because it's not even really easy to follow votes on a mailing list. It would really be ideal to have some kind of system where you can log in and vote and things like that. And there's websites that do that. We've used, for example, I think it's OpaVote or something, opavote.com. Although I think you have to pay for that unless it's a really, really small amount of people voting. We should probably have a lot more of our own systems that support this stuff, like setting up our own open source things. But that's kind of the point, I think, that locals and states should think about this, because the pandemic is not over. And even if you were to say that COVID is sort of over, that doesn't mean that there won't be something new, because we're not handling COVID. So COVID is really SARS-2, right? The SARS virus. And so, is it going to become SARS-3 or SARS-4 or whatever? We're not handling a pandemic. So, like, the longer it spreads, the more it can mutate into something else. We don't know what comes in the future. And just as an equity thing, making sure more people can participate. So, the communications is something I really hammer on for us to think about transitioning to. And unfortunately, there's not like a party-wide plan for this yet. So maybe that's something we can work on. But it kind of starts at the local levels. The other comment I wanted to throw in here about just how the pandemic affected people is, for example, we have a really great candidate who is running for state representative this year in Pittsburgh, who is working class healthcare worker. As a healthcare worker, she's completely swamped with work. So part of the thing was, like, once she got on the ballot, she had a really hard time campaigning. She did as much as she could, but when you're a healthcare worker and you're working all these long hours and double shifts and things like that, because so many of the healthcare industry has gotten sick themselves or retired or just exhausted from 3 years of fighting a pandemic and working all these extra shifts and stuff. It's really hard to run a campaign for office when you're like that. And so, we talked about some ways to support people through the pandemic, about, and supporting candidates in particular that can be exhausted with all this stuff. Can we bring them, dinner sometimes just to kind of take some stress off of them? Can we help with other aspects of the campaign? So, dealing with the pandemic, I think, has been a lot of issues, but also a good opportunity for us to think about how we can organize ourselves differently.
Yeah. So, the party found, on the local level, the party found itself somewhat, kneecapped by the pandemic, right? Our responses to it varied, but we weren't in a great place as far as an organizing, unit.